In this video, I'm going to show you how I transformed a glass bowl into a thriving ecosystem. It's going to involve showing you how to build the substrate system, how to plant some plants, how to put some hardscape in, and then finally let the tank mature and season for a while before adding some shrimp, which are the final and biggest inhabitants of this tank. The first step will be to create the substrate system, which is basically the soil or the sand layer. And in this tank, I'm going to start with a mix of peat, topsoil, and manure, which is the soil layer that will give the plants their nutrients. This layer gets wetted down to get rid of any kind of air bubbles there might be or gases that might be there. This layer is then covered in a good portion of sand to help cap it down, to keep it underneath the sand so that it doesn't get into the water column. So with a tank like this, I push the sand to the back of the bowl a little bit to create some perspective so that when we put in our hardscape and our plants, it gives us a bit of depth. So the hardscape is the rocks and wood that make up the aquarium environment. It just makes the aquarium look a little bit more interesting and gives creatures a place to hide and surfaces to eat from and hang out on. So I settled on something I liked and I glued it in place with some super glue. And the next step that we have to worry about is to plant our plants. So the plants I usually plant first while the tank is empty are called epiphytes or rhizome plants, and they don't get put into the soil, they instead get attached to parts of the hardscape such as the rocks or the log. So I include some scatter gravel just to give a little bit of interest to the foreground. I grow aquarium plants immersed in clear totes. I have potting soil on the bottom of the totes, and I cut the plants if I want to propagate them at the nodes, which is where the leaves come out of the stem. The plant will then throw out roots and will root in the potting soil and grow, and I place them under bright lights to help them grow. What I wanted to do is to glue some of the small bits of moss, they're called Java moss, onto a rock. And they grow really nicely when they're attached to something like a rock or a piece of wood. It doesn't take much moss either, you just glue some on with some super glue and then it gets some light and it grows like crazy. So at this point I'm sticking some of the stem plants into the sand, and they'll eventually root down and find their way into the soil where there's a bunch of nutrients. So typically the stem plants get planted towards the back of the aquarium because they grow really long and give you a nice background to look at. Whereas plants like moss or other kinds of smaller plants could be planted in the foreground. I'm also using a pair of long tweezers to help plant the stem plants. It helps poke them into the substrate without making too much of a disturbance. this process can be done when there is water in the tank as well. It's a little bit easier than with the epiphyte plants. And so here when I'm filling up the tank, I just try and break the water stream a little bit so it doesn't mess up all the sand and the foreground rocks. Some people would put a plastic bag down or some bubble wrap to help spread out some of the water flow. I find my hand worked pretty well. This is a pretty small tank. And this is just regular tap water going into the aquarium. You would treat it with some kind of water conditioner to take out harmful substances like chlorine and chloramines. I actually found a piece of driftwood on the beach in Nova Scotia, and it was pretty salty because it was from the ocean. And then I actually boiled and then soaked it for a long time, for a couple months actually, until I could no longer smell any kind of salt. So here I am adding some frog bit to the tank, and there's a couple pieces of duckweed that managed to get in, but it's not a big deal. So once the aquarium's planted and filled up, I put it on the aquarium rack I have, and it's placed under a grow light. I put some ram's horn snails in the tank to create waste and help the aquarium cycle, which means build up the bacteria that will help break down ammonia and other waste products into less dangerous substances such as nitrate, which feed the plants. It always amazes me when the snails do this on the surface of the water. As you can see, I've added in some different plants, such as Alodia, which is a very fast-growing plant to help clean the aquarium. The plant growth went nuts. So the roots dug their way down into the soil to find nutrients. The moss on the rocks spread right out and reached towards the light. Yeah, so this is Alodia that's been added. It's kind of like a floating plant, pulls nutrients out of the water. So there's some tiny little cyclops scooting along the glass and a baby ram's horn snail. And that's a springtail. They like to live on top of the floating vegetation. I used to think they were aphids, but they do no harm to the plants whatsoever. You can see these little white worms are called detritus worms. They live inside the substrate. They like to climb around on the glass. Here's another cyclops zooming around. And these are all signs that the tank is starting to age and starting to support a little ecosystem. That's a female cyclops with some egg sacs. Here's some roots from the frog bit that are growing really well, and if you look carefully, you can see some little detritus worms crawling around on those roots. So it's been a few months and the tank is now ready for some cherry shrimp. I ended up putting about 8 shrimp of various sizes in the tank. You can see some malms starting to move around. That's just waste products from dying plants or from snails going to the bathroom. And the shrimp start to look around immediately and try and find some food and some places to hide. They had the zoomies. They were zooming around in circles for a good amount of time. I ended up putting a very small filter and a heater in the tank as well, just to move some water around and keep it warm. The shrimp are able to find a lot of food that's on top of the hardscape and on the wood. This tank requires very little food, and things like algae and microorganisms and biofilm are plenty to feed the organisms that are living in the tank. I did put a few small pieces of limestone in the tank to provide some extra minerals and nutrients for the shrimp when they molt. This is actually a molt of a shrimp. And often when shrimp molt, the next thing that happens is sometimes the females will become pregnant. This female here is considered buried. She's got a bunch of little eggs on her abdomen, and they look like little berries, and she fans them with her pliopods and keeps them well oxygenated, and they'll hatch in probably a week or so. She's about an inch long. She's a small but beautiful little shrimp. So bye-bye, Mama Shrimp, and I would just like to say thanks for tuning in, and I hope you took something away from this video. I really appreciate you being here.